We'll just give it a couple more minutes as people filter on. All right, I think we have reached a critical mass. And so good afternoon, everybody. The time is 1:03 on January 25th, 2021. Hereby call this third meeting of the Climate Initiatives Task Force to order. And Lindsay, will you please call the roll?
Sure thing, Harry. Members, as I call out your name, if you can state that you are here, and I'll note if we have a quorum or not. Harry Vorhoff.
Present.
Mark Moses.
Present.
Bryn Haas.
Present.
Brad Lambert.
Here.
Jason Lanclaw.
Present.
Lords Iterum.
Present.
Joey Bro. Eric Calavoda.
Present.
Selby Bush.
Present.
Tim Hardy. Tim, I see your video on. I don't think we get your audio though. Okay, I'll note that you're here.
Let the record reflect that Tim Hardy is present, but working on his audio.
Okay, Bill Robertson. Tyler Gray.
Present.
Greg Bowser.
Present.
Jonathan Borg.
Present.
Virginia Burkett.
Present.
Karen Gotro.
Present.
Flozell Daniels.
Present.
Terrence Chambers.
Here.
Jeff Schwartz. Colette Pichon Battle.
Present.
Chief Cheryl Darter.
Present.
Rob Perchick. And Camille Manning Broom.
Present.
Okay, Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Lindsay. And hello again, everybody. I hope everyone had a restful holiday and folks have their batteries charged up because it's going to be a busy year for this task force. Over the course of this year, we will be crafting Louisiana's first strategic plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions statewide. Now, that shouldn't be news to anyone on this task force, but I think it's worth keeping front of mind as we go about our work because quite frankly, it's a big deal. This is the first attempt at crafting recommendations, but it won't be the last. Like the state's coastal master plan, the report that we submit to the governor next year will be a living document. And also, like the coastal master plan, the climate plan will mature and become more sophisticated as this work continues over the years and quite frankly, the decades. And while we'll attempt to provide as much specificity through our work this year, that may not be possible with some actions. And I think we need to be realistic about that expectation as we set out now. But to the extent further research, development, discussion is needed, we can certainly include those recommendations for further study, review, or discussion in our final report. So I think that is important to keep front of mind as well. So today we'll be receiving presentations from staff on 3 documents: an interim report to the governor, second, what I like to call the draft partial final report, and third, the action template for generating ideas on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. With respect to the interim report and the draft partial final report, I think it would be helpful for and for the public's benefit for me to provide a little context. So since the December meeting that we had at the end of December, the planning team set out to draft a status update to Governor Edwards as required by the executive order. This interim report is due next Monday. The planning team circulated a draft to the task force members last week with the thought that it would serve as the interim report. However, erring on the side of over-delivering, to humble brag my fellow staff, the planning team ended up drafting what very well could and be developed into the beginning sections of the final report, which isn't due until next year. So having this content drafted this early is great because we now have time to solicit input not only from task force members, but also from the committees, advisor groups, and from the public. So we'll recommend that the task force not act on this draft partial final report until after there's been an opportunity for public review and comment, and we'll address that later on the agenda, but we'll be recommending a 3-month public comment period to ensure enough time for the public to participate. So while we don't need to act on that draft partial final report, we do need to send the governor, the CPRA board, and the legislative oversights an interim report, which should stick to a more factual account of the charge of the task force identified in the executive order, the structure, membership, summary of meetings that we've had, and so Lindsay and Charles will be going over that in the presentation, but I did just want to provide that background before we jump in. I also want to note that we are trying a new meeting format through Zoom webinar, and believe it or not, 10 months into the pandemic, this is our first attempt at managing a webinar. So please bear with us if there are any technical issues, but we thought it was important to create or use a platform that allowed the public to speak their comments. So we will, in addition to submitting your public comment through the email climate@la.gov, we'll also be accepting comment through the chat. But if you wish, you can raise your hand icon and we can call on you, and so you can speak your comments if you so choose. And so with that, before diving into the substance, let's first approve the minutes from the last meeting. And those were circulated last week. I hope everybody had a chance to review. And does anyone move to approve the minutes?
Sure, Mr. Chair, I'll move to accept the minutes as reported.
Okay, there's a motion to accept the minutes by Mr. Daniels. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Haas. Any discussion? Any public comment? Don't see any. And all that in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, nay. All right. Minutes approved. That's the easy one. All right. So moving on. Overview of the draft initial sections of the climate report and that will be by Mr. Charles Sutcliffe and Lindsay Cooper.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to start this one off, and Lindsay will take over halfway through, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to share my screen, everybody, and hopefully this goes okay. Can everybody see the green slide up there? Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah. All right. So as Harry mentioned, we've got two big items. They're going to be covered over two presentations today, and this first one is going to have quite a bit on it. We want to make sure that we are really clearly distinguishing between what this draft partial final report is and the interim report. We want to just kind of be clear there again. And then the most of this is going to be a kind of a section by section preview for the public and for review and discussion of the longer report highlights. What we highlighting the portions that we including in the interim report, but we're going to have like a kind of a special deep dive on the work plan for 2021 because I think everyone's interested in seeing how that is going to come through. And then we also are going to revisit the fundamental objectives in the committee advisory group reports. And then so that all of that together is agenda item number 5 on the agenda, and then agenda item number 6 that'll come at the very end will be an approval from this group to kind of what the contents of the interim report should be. So the purpose of the final report is to both provide the context for why the state is taking action and to introduce the actions we plan on pursuing to meet the greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals in the executive order. So as Harry had mentioned earlier, what was shared with the task force and will shortly be shared with the whole public is more of a first cut at the background and context portion of the final report document. So the background section will get into the scientific underpinnings of the work, current and future impacts to our state, including how those impacts are being disproportionately felt across populations, the cost of inaction, the opportunities associated with taking action, and all these things. So what was shared was a draft and contained only part of what will ultimately be that final report. I just want to say now too that we really appreciate everyone's willingness to work with us through this, and especially those who referenced this draft as a good start. I think that was gracious, and we appreciate that. We look forward to spending more time with the comments that you did send and to improving this by incorporating your thoughts and those of the public into this as we go forward. So we have already received a lot of excellent comments from the task force, and we look forward to building those in the report further with new resources that you point out, just your insights in general, and anything that comes in from the public too. So that is what I wanted to say about the final climate report. The interim report we will be discussing today will be a much different document, and I think that it's an important course correction for us that we're taking in response to kind of feedback and kind of just in terms of what we actually produced and what was the right fit for that kind of content. So the interim report is not what we circulated last week. This is going to be a stripped down update to the governor. And as Harry mentioned, kind of facts forward kind of an approach. So who is on the various committees and task force, how many meetings have occurred, what has been accomplished, and how we plan on using the next year to come up with the final climate report with both context and solutions for Louisiana. So I think that report, the interim report, makes more sense to be a letter from the chair and not as a report from the task force, but we can kind of discuss that further on in the agenda. So just to kind of walk through some of the things that we circulated for the public and to kind of really hone in on what we plan on keeping for the report to the governor. This is some of the table of contents that we sent. So if you look at the sections that we sent to you for review earlier last week, many of these are more appropriate for the final report than the interim report. They will also benefit greatly, I would say, from additional time to improve them and from wider public participation. So we all fully recognize that. So from the first half of the draft that we circulated, we're only proposing that these three components be addressed, the ones in the blue boxes. So we want to include the membership, the charge of the task force, and the update on the 2020 inventory progress, but not the part of the problem context that includes more information on Louisiana's emissions context. That can be improved as well as we get new data in from the 2020 inventory. So that's kind of our thinking on that section. From the second half of the report that we sent out, we definitely want to propose including the planning process and the 2021 work plan and meeting schedule. We think that this is going to be important for an update to the governor. And we do think there are good reasons to include the synthesized fundamental objectives and the committee reports, but more so as a snapshot in time, I think, for the committee reports in particularly. But I want to come back to those two later in the presentation so we can have more of a discussion around that. So to kind of recap, what we would definitely like to include in the interim report to the governor is listed here in black. And the only section that was not in the draft that we circulated but we do think is important to include is going to be what's listed here in italics, this overview of meetings to date. And so we think we can have that for sure. We would also like to have discussion today, as I said, on the fundamental objectives and the committee and advisory group reports that are shown in green. These could be added to their interim report, but we wanted to get a sense from you for your thoughts on including this, their readiness, your comfort level with the language, those kinds of things before we did that. So we will be going over the remaining sections of the draft that we circulated, primarily to preview them for the public and to give them a sense for all the different sections that we want to include on this and that we are asking feedback on. So I will walk through those, again, kind of just highlighting which ones we think are ready to go to the governor and the ones that are definitely a work in progress. So if that's okay, I'm going to kind of start walking us through this content. Are we doing okay there? Let's see a few heads. Okay, thank you. So the first two sections I think are straightforward, and these will be largely included in the interim report to the governor, I think. But the charge part could be stripped down in some ways. A lot of that content is already in the executive order. But these will obviously both be posted in what's included for the public to view too. So we think it helps provide important context for what we're doing and outlines the parameters of our task. So these two are pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to go on to the next one where I think that we had a lot of, let me just point out too some of the nomenclature that I'm using here. So I've just got a big check mark where I think that these are pretty uncontroversial and should be, we're recommending to be included in an update to the governor. And then I've got some sections that have an X where we know that they're not ready to go. And so I wanted to kind of point that out to you. And then sometimes I've got an either or kind of a thing where we can kind of have a discussion piece. So under the need for action, climate risks Louisiana and the opportunities posed by climate action, we think these two sections are not ready for inclusion to the governor in the interim report. So but again, for the public and for everybody that didn't get a chance to review the report so far, the climate risk to Louisiana is a section we do think is important for telling the story of why we need to take action on this issue for the final report, but not something that we need to come to an agreement on at this stage for the interim report. For the public's awareness, the majority of the information in this section came from either the National Climate Assessment or from a deeper dive into some of the articles cited within the National Climate Assessment. It covers the global risks associated with temperature increases of 1.5 degrees Celsius, as well as some of the general findings of impacts to the Southeast region of the United States, many of which do have resonance with Louisiana. And then it spends a little time diving into a little more detail on community impacts, environmental impacts, and economic impacts. In the final report, we will want to further flesh out these sections with additional resources and perspectives. And that's we are in full agreement, I think, with all the comments that we saw there. On the opportunities posed by climate action section, this is another area that I think it is important to include in the final report to help capture the benefits of addressing this difficult issue, but it is not yet ready for inclusion in the interim report to the governor. So this section currently includes some discussion of health benefits, opportunities to advance equity, and examples of economic benefits, but we know it does not yet do the topic justice. And so I know there were a lot of good suggestions for improvement to both of these sections, frankly, that we've already started to review. We need a little more time with those. And these will both get, I think, much better after we have your feedback and the public's feedback on these. So we can just kind of really articulate more clearly some of the impacts and the benefits from taking action here. So this section will also evolve too, I would say, as our committees and advisory groups continue to have conversations on these particular topics. So these are at a starting point, and so that's why they're getting marked with an X here today, just for your awareness here. The problem context section that we circulated really tries to kind of recognize that this is a global problem, but that we all have a part to play in the solution. And so this section intends to situate Louisiana's emissions within the larger context of emissions. So again, the data that we relied on, so the emissions overview for some of this section was drawn from the EPA's most recent national inventory, which is data through 2018. And the Louisiana counterpart is just not yet uniformly up to date. Some sections are better than others. And then obviously that is what Dr. Dismukes at the LSU Center for River Energy Studies is working on, and we heard from him last month. And so we felt like we should present the full Louisiana context in the final report only, since the 2020 inventory is not yet complete. But we do think it's important to kind of include an update to the governor on the progress being made on the 2020 inventory and how that new document will improve over prior efforts. So I think that is something that we do want to put forward for you guys. Okay, so then to kind of look at this, the second half of the draft that we circulated are more process sections, I would call them. And so they're based less on research that the planning team was able to do and more on the conversations that we've been having either at the task force or through our advisory groups and committee meetings. From these sections, we think an explanation of the planning process and the 2021 work plan and meeting schedule are essential pieces of information to share with the governor in the interim report. But we did want to get more feedback from the group on the objectives and the committee and advisory group reports. So that's kind of why those two are in blue for sure. And then we wanted to kind of see what everybody's temperature was on the other two. So the planning process section really tries to lay the groundwork for understanding how the different components of the climate initiative are going to work together to arrive at this final set of climate actions, and really how we plan on accomplishing all the challenges that were laid out in the executive order, namely the arrival at a balanced, implementable actions that are based on wide stakeholder engagement. And I think that key is inside this process that we've adopted. So this section walks through the different steps of structured decision-making, showing how we move from a problem, determine objectives, gather alternative solutions, evaluate consequences and trade-offs, and then make an informed decision. We know that this section will give important context for the public as they try to understand how decisions are being made through this process. And so this is definitely going to be what's part of what's put online for the public to see and understand and comment on. And then Lindsay right now is going to walk us through the 2021 work plan, where this process and the structure really come together in a series of meetings and work activities that are going to really kind of show it in action. So we're going to switch it over to her for a little bit and talk about the work plan, which is, again, one of these sections that we think is crucial for including to the governor. So Lindsay, I'll let you take over from here, and I'll just move the slides and you tell me you're ready.
Sounds good. Thanks, Charles. And good afternoon, members. I know Charles just went over the SDM process overview, but I thought it'd be helpful to bring this back to the center of attention, since we've really framed the 2021 workflow according to these 6 steps of the process to put in context of what work is required at each step and who's doing the work at each step. So over the coming slides, I'll outline our work plan first through a Gantt chart that shows the components of the workflow and responsibilities that belong to each of our groups. And then second, I'll dive into the meeting schedule for the different groups as well. And again, putting it all in the context of these 6 steps to bring it back to something that we're familiar with. Charles, can you advance to the next one? And so you guys got this Gantt chart in the interim report, the draft final report that was circulated last week. And I know it's a lot of information that's on one slide and many components are happening simultaneously. So it's a lot to take in one glance, but I'll break down each step of the process so we can explore what this means for the next year for our 12-month work plan. And I would also just like to frame here the urgency of this effort. We know it's a lot of work that's been compressed into a year timeline, but our emission reduction goals extend all the way through 2050. So this is just step 1 of our process of initiating this phase of Louisiana's climate initiative. And we framed it, I know February of 2022 might seem like an arbitrary timeline, but we framed it in this way. In case we need to move with legislative action in the 2022 session, we wanted to make sure we had some actions and strategies that might have to move forward through legislation produced by then. So that's what we kept in mind with having that February deadline and the need to move quickly on that in this governor's term. So just to reiterate the roles of each of the groups on this Gantt chart, you can see that the task force is outlined in black. Ultimately, they're our decision-making body. A lot of their work is more heavily weighted in the second half of the year in those later steps of the SDM process when we have to start making some hard decisions. And then you can see advisory groups are denoted in the green, and their work is going to be concentrated in the second half of 2021, more in the evaluatory and revision role. Sector committees are in light blue. They have a huge role to play in this first half of 2021 as we're developing out emission reduction actions and strategies among the sectors. The planning team is in dark blue. We're kind of all over the map, helping with a lot of different things at once and pulling together different pieces and making sure that all of the components are tying together over time. And then I'll say in the gray, we've denoted the other role, which is some key components where we want the public to be plugged in through the public call for action ideas, which I'll talk through in step 3. And then in step 6 on having a public comment period for the climate plan. And then also in gray is the greenhouse gas inventory. And so Charles, if you can move to the next one, I'll walk us through in these blue boxes each step of the SDM process. So this first step covers much of what we have discussed for the past 10 weeks since the group first met in November. And we've started to define the problem of climate change and frame it in the context in which we will make decisions. As Charles noted, we realized in trying to flesh out the interim report that this will be an ongoing conversation, understanding the risk in Louisiana and how we can articulate that well. But other important components of this step, aside from defining climate risk, is establishing the need for the greenhouse gas inventory update. This will be updated in the first half of 2021, and we'll have some preliminary deliverables from that as we start evaluating emission reduction strategies. Other components of this step are framing sector opportunities and challenges, and also defining climate equity, which the Equity Advisory Group has helped to frame and define climate change in the context of what equity means for climate change. So these last two components, the sector committee opportunities and challenges and defining climate equity, will be key components as we move into really the initial work of 2021. We'll start off next month with a joint meeting between the task force, the advisory groups and committees to think through some of these opportunities and through climate equity. And so that's important to keep in mind. We're sort of building up to that February meeting with those two components. Charles, if you can advance to the next one. We've also spent a lot of time the past 10 weeks on the second step of identifying and synthesizing fundamental objectives. This has been a major component that has been enhanced and helped along with advisory groups and the sector committees as well. And so the planning team has spent a lot of time since that December meeting on refining objectives based on feedback from you all in our December meeting. And then that brings us up to the interim report in February in the second step. So this is where we are now. And then as we transition to the third step on the next slide, then we'll spend much of the first half in identifying alternatives. So a lot of this year will be focused on this identification of actions. And there are a lot of moving parts in this one. So I'll spend some time breaking down what each of these components mean and who carries the responsibilities of each. So the first step is best practice research. This has been led by the planning team as we're learning from other states and also from the sector committees, as you saw in step one, on those best practices that they've begun to identify that Louisiana can learn from. And at this same time, we've also developed the action template, which was circulated to you all last week. And we'll go through that next. And we'll approve that hopefully in this meeting, though we aren't going to launch the action template yet until that joint February meeting that I was referring to, so that it gives you all time to start thinking through and developing what those actions might look like. And also for our sector committees and advisory groups, we circulated a draft to them, and we'll also circulate the final to give them a little bit of time, almost a month, until they have to hit the ground running on the action template. And you can see in gray on this third step, there's the public call for action ideas, which will run in tandem with the action template. We want the public to be a part of proposing draft actions for the different sector committees. And for that reason, we've created the action template that will be accessible not only to our committees and advisory groups and task force, but also to the public. And sector committees will also be developing their actions in February as this public call is launched. And you can see that in blue right below the public call for action ideas. And the sector committees are particularly tasked with developing strong action proposals, but that doesn't diminish the role of the public call for ideas. It's important that we're bringing those ideas together throughout the process. And advisory groups in this time will be working on applying equity and economic lenses and scientific and legal considerations to the template, and also to helping sectors in better understanding how to apply those advisory areas to their developing actions. So after this initial phase of development happens, you can see that we'll move into this cross-disciplinary review of actions. So as I mentioned, we'll have a joint meeting in February. We'll also have another joint meeting in April that will allow, after that initial phase of development and brainstorming, all of the groups will come back together, and we'll be able to have conversations on cross-cutting and cross-sectoral strategies that are most important and will benefit from that coordinating time. And then sectors will then continue to develop their strategies. And the differentiation here between the strategies and actions is that strategies are just the suites of actions. So we're starting to organize, we're starting to create some categories and put together what those sectors are really producing. So from that cross-disciplinary review, the sectors will go back into their individual groups and start to put together the strategies, and then offer up their draft strategy proposals around the June timeframe. So you can see just from those last few steps, we're going to heavily rely on the committees in developing out those actions and strategies. And I'll go back to the one component that I skipped over in this step, which is identification of potential net zero emission pathways. So this is something that the planning team will be working behind the scenes on to begin to understand this bigger math equation of how do we reach our 2050 emission targets of carbon neutrality. And what does that look like? What do we need to plug into our equation to meet that challenge? And this is looking at some broader emission pathways as the sector committees are really diving into the more specific actions. So we're trying to have that more longer term vision while the committees are working on determining the actions. So just to recap on this step before we move forward, a lot is happening here, but this is a critical piece to identify the actions and start organizing strategies that we will later evaluate in step 4 and 5 and make decisions based off of. So we're heavily going to rely on the sector committees here to help us develop the good ideas of everything we could possibly do. We really want to lay it all out there in this initial phase. And we want the strategies that move forward in June to be reflective of the public ideas, the sector actions, all of our advisory lenses, and also the cross-disciplinary review. So bringing all of that together in the third step. Charles, if you can advance to the fourth. So that's going to set us up well as we enter into evaluating alternatives and forecasting the consequences. So you can first note here that the planning team has already been and will continue to work on identifying ways to measure proposed strategies and emission pathways against fundamental objectives throughout the whole first half of the year. And so this is a lot of the reason why the development of fundamental objectives is so important. It will determine how we evaluate strategies in tandem with their greenhouse gas reduction potential. So we must understand how the proposed alternatives will impact all of our objectives that are deemed fundamental to the effort. And as you can see, this is carried heavily by the planning team, also in concert with the advisory groups. So after draft strategies are developed at the end of step 3 in that June timeframe, there will be this review, organize, and refine stage. This will be led by the planning team to identify cross-sector strategies and begin to compile and organize different actions from that full scope of actions that was developed in step 3. And in this stage, the task force will also have to set priorities of which actions we'll focus on during this year. So we recognize that it would be impossible to address and evaluate every action that is proposed and considered in that third step. So it's necessary to set priorities for this year, what is attainable for us to really review and evaluate and make decisions upon in this year, knowing that the effort, this climate initiative, nor the task force will disband in February of 2022. And I'll discuss more on the priorities as we get into the meeting schedule. I think that will help put in context a little bit what that means. And this last step of number 4 is evaluating consequences of proposed strategies by advisory groups. So they'll start to evaluate consequences against the task force objectives through their expert lenses. This is also why we had advisory groups help in development of objectives, so they're able to ensure their advisory areas are reflected and evaluated well in the action review process. And so that takes us through step 4 of evaluation of the actions, and now into step 5, where we're looking at evaluation among strategies. So this is really starting to bring all of the pieces together. And you can tell from step 5, there are 2 different trade-off analyses that will be done here. But first, I want to focus on that middle component. Step 4 ends at evaluating consequences of proposed strategies by advisory groups. And so the planning team and the committees will then come back after advisory groups provide those evaluations and be able to make some revisions and take some of the advice offered by advisory groups to clean up their actions and better reflect the advisory areas. And then advisory groups will score and put a final number on the actions and strategies, but there is an opportunity for some tweaking by the sectors in and after the evaluation. And so the two parts of the trade-off analysis I'll talk through next. This initial trade-off analysis among emission pathways will be looking at the overall problem of different emission pathways to get to net zero by 2050. So this is not looking at specific actions, but it's taking what we talked about in step 3, identifying ways to meet our big math problem. We'll then begin to measure, okay, what is the best for Louisiana, and understand the trade-offs among those different pathways, and hopefully get some clarity on that larger pathway that we need to be on. And once we finish that trade-off, we will enter into the second trade-off of evaluating strategies based on their impact to fundamental objectives. So this is based on the advisory group evaluation of actions from step 4 and the revisions provided by the committees coming from that. So it's the task force that's going to evaluate these trade-offs among the different strategies in this step. So looking at step 5, it'll give us a lot of clarity on understanding results of our larger math problem, and then also looking towards the specific actions as well. So that brings us into step 6, which is the final step of the process. The task force will review the results of those trade-offs among strategies and actions, and begin to make decisions about what we want to include in the draft final report. What are those strategies we feel comfortable moving forward? And then we'll publish a draft of the plan in November and have a month for public comment, and provide a revised report to the task force, and really allowing a lot of time for revision from producing the draft plan to the approved final plan. So it won't be like the interim report with just a few weeks in between, but really allowing time for public comment and for the task force to revise and consider what should be approved in that final plan. And then the last thing I'll note is identifying implementation pathways, which is also in this 6th step. You can tell that this is something ongoing from the first quarter of 2021, really because we recognize it's important to have implementation set in place before we even approve this plan. We don't want to just come up with a nice plan in February of 2022 with no ways to implement what we've come up with. And as we talk through the action plan, you'll be able to see this, but that's a heavy focus of the action template, is that we begin to identify implementation pathways from the very beginning of the action templates. And so with that, there's a lot of moving pieces of each step, but that's the overview of the workflow and how the responsibilities fall on different groups. And so next I'll talk through the meeting timeline, and that will sort of put this in context of our 2021 timeline and what that looks like in terms of meetings for all of our groups. So turning to the schedule, similar to how I broke down the last slides, the Gantt chart in terms of the SDM process, I'll do the same for this meeting schedule as well to keep that consistency. And I'd just like to note, I know that looking at this at first glance, it's a lot of different meetings, but a lot of the work will happen in between meetings. And these meetings will really be checkpoints where we talk through either the actions or strategies or pieces that have the most contention or need to be brought to the attention of the whole group. The planning process, the planning team will be doing a lot of weaving together throughout this planning process. And we'll also have great people in the different committees and advisory groups assigned with homework and tasks in between meetings that really help tie everything together. So Charles, if you can move to the next one. I've highlighted here in this blue box what we've already done. This is step 1 and 2 of the SDM process. And this highlights the first 3 task force meetings of the year and the first round of committee and advisory group meetings. So we've already done this. Now moving into the 3rd step of the process, of identifying actions, we'll have these meetings highlighted in the blue box. And as I mentioned on the Gantt chart, you can tell there's a heavy focus on the sector committees here. We'll really rely on them to get through this part of the process. And also, as I mentioned on the Gantt chart, there are 2 all hands on deck meetings, as we have deemed them. There will be one in February of 2021 and one in April of 2021. This is bringing together the task force, advisory groups, and committees all in one meeting. We heard a lot of comments from you guys about the need for these cross-sector conversations, the need for everyone to have meetings together and get on the same page. So for that reason, we've created these big all hands on deck meetings. So I'll first look at this first one in February. This will be the kickoff for actions and strategies. This is where we'll kick off the action template. We'll also have the U.S. Climate Alliance come talk about best practices from other places and start to identify those best practices and possible emission pathways. Then as well, as I mentioned, we'll have the presentation from the Equity Advisory Group on defining equity in the context of climate change for this effort. And this will set us up well for the individual groups that meet again in March. So you can see that after the February meeting, we'll have committee meetings by themselves and then advisory group meetings by themselves in March. And the committees will begin to think through and develop actions based on what they think is actionable as a committee and have a good brainstorming session around putting together their actions. And the advisory groups will also reconvene and begin to consider what guidance they need to give to committees in the action and strategy design, and also begin to think through how we'll measure action and emission pathways against fundamental objectives. So that'll be a key role for them to play. And this time, it will come back together in April for another all hands on deck meeting. And this will serve as that cross-sectoral review that I mentioned on the Gantt chart, the cross-disciplinary review. And this will bring extra focus to those different strategies that might need to be considered across groups or might need some enhancement by the different advisory areas. So allowing just a long meeting where everyone can come to the table and begin to explore these cross-sector strategies. And also hear from advisory groups on any necessary considerations or cross-cutting lenses that they need the committees to be aware of as well. And I'll mention that the public call for ideas will also end at this time. So the action template will run from the February meeting, the February all hands on deck meeting, through the April all hands on deck meeting. And that's that public call of action proposal ideas, just so it gives the committees enough time to synthesize and really work through what they've been given by the public. And in May, the committees will come back together. They'll take their notes from that cross-sector workshop and start to organize actions and strategies. As I mentioned, these strategies are just suites of actions. So it shows they're starting to get organized and starting to put their actions in categories and understand what they want to move forward and propose. Also, in this third step of the STM process, there are 2 special science advisory group meetings. You can tell that there's one in February and then there's another one in May/June. And the science advisory group is helping to develop or to provide oversight of the 2020 inventory update. So in February, they'll review methodology of the inventory and help us better identify and measure emission sinks in Louisiana so that those can be quantified more accurately in this inventory. And then the SAG will also come back together in May or June, early summer, to review the draft inventory update and provide feedback on any considerations or any things that might have been missed in that review. Moving on to step 4 and 5 of the SDM process. This is sort of the evaluation phase. And as I mentioned on the Gantt chart, this is heavily relying on the advisory groups and on the task force as well to provide that evaluation lens. So we'll first understand consequences of actions and then trade-offs among actions. So advisory groups will help understand the consequences of actions through having two meetings in this time. And the task force will have meetings that start facilitating that trade-off among actions. So I'll note that in this July task force meeting, a few big things are going to happen as we go into the summer. So to put this in frame of the past step, we've just identified the full stretch of strategies that could be done by sectors, and they have set those in place and proposed those to the task force. So in July, the task force will begin to review these proposed strategies, identify gaps, and set priorities. So to reiterate what I mentioned in the Gantt chart, we recognize that this is the initial year of the climate task force, and we can't address every strategy that's necessary to reduce emissions. So it's important that we set priorities for this year. And generally, we could set priorities based on what is most actionable to meet our near-term goals. What do we have consensus around? What might require legislative action? Maybe we'd like to prioritize cross-sectoral strategies. This is ultimately the task force's decision, but the planning team will provide some recommendations since we're in all the conversations across groups. And we also understand it's likely many actions might require further study or research. So we can identify that in July and task that out to be researched and table decision-making until after February of 2022 until we have more clarity on it. This is really in the spirit of using everyone's time effectively and not dragging on deliberation of actions that we can't quite make a decision on yet. So also in this task force meeting, the group will be presented with a review of the greenhouse gas inventory update as well, which will be critical as we move into that evaluation of trade-offs and understanding the consequences of actions and strategies. So also in this blue box, you can see that the advisory groups will meet in the beginning of August to provide comments based on the committee strategies that were offered. Committees will then reconvene at the end of August to revise these strategies based on advisory group comments. And then advisory groups will then evaluate and score the strategy portfolios from the sectors. So there's a little room for sectors to revise based on feedback from advisory groups. And then advisory groups provide that final score, and the task force will meet in October to begin reviewing trade-offs and optimizing outcomes. And the planning team will work between these meetings to incorporate feedback and set the task force up for this October meeting. So we know that's a pretty quick turnaround between August, September, and October. So we'll be working with all of the different groups to make sure that we can meet that timeline and review strategies effectively. And in November, the task force will meet again to review trade-offs and start to make decisions. And that will make up the crux of the report, as I mentioned earlier, which the planning team will be compiling with other components before we reach that December meeting. So this brings us to step 6 of the process, where we'll make decisions. In December, the planning team will present a draft final report to the task force and then receive their feedback from it. The draft report will also be published for public comment then. And then in January, the planning team will work to incorporate that feedback in the public comment and present a final report to the task force in a year from now, and hopefully have it approved and sent to the governor as our initial report. So I know this is a lot of information on the workflow, the responsibilities, and the meeting schedule. And hopefully this laid it out in a way that made more sense and helps put all of the different pieces together. But with that, I'll take any questions that you guys might have on that.
This is Eric Calavota. Really, so the sector committees, they really need to be done by June, pretty much, right? Okay, so we got like 5 months.
Right.
Okay.
And the cross-sector meetings will happen before that?
Right. The cross-sector meetings will happen in that February and then in that April meeting, really, when they can start to work together. Those will be the official meetings, and we understand that other conversations might need to supplement those official meetings to ensure coordination among sectors.
So many of our recommendations in the Land Use, Housing, and Building Committee will need to be carefully coordinated with the Transportation Committee, the Power Distribution Committee as well.
We know that, and we really encourage that, actually, the coordination among different groups, and fully anticipate that a lot of recommendations and strategies that will be made are cross-sectoral. And that's why we've tried to make some space for that in the official calendar, but also by having room between May and August, leave some space if further conversations need to happen.
Lindsay, one more thing. It's Eric Calavota again. The July 2021 GHG inventory update, that's fixed, right? I mean, they're not, everybody I think is anxious to see what that is right now because the information we're using is so old. I mean, if that slips, that's going to mess everything up, because we really, we can make a bunch of recommendations from the sector committees until we see that updated inventory. We need that in July if we're going to come back in August and revise our proposed strategies and such. But if that gets delayed, that's going to be a real problem.
Absolutely. And that's why you can see the the Science Advisory Group will meet in May or June to review the draft inventory. So that leaves us a buffer of 1 or 2 or 3 months of having those initial results of the inventory to that July meeting. So that's why we built in some buffer just in case.
And this is Harry. To your point, Eric, we should be getting some draft slides or pieces of information, draft components of the inventory along the way. And Dr. Dismukes knows that, the purpose of his work, and that it's meant to inform this body and the committees and advisory groups. And so we'll be feeding information as it's available, and may need to qualify that it's in draft form, or isn't final yet, but to help inform the process along the way. So good question, but yes, we anticipate that that July is the final inventory, and that there's going to be information to be shared beforehand.
And included in that is sharing it with the sector committees and advisory groups, just to kind of respond to a question that we saw.
Yeah, I mean, if it's when it's available and meets the standards that LSU has for themselves, then yes, I think we want to share that information as quickly as we can.
Great.
So let me ask, this is Flozell Daniels. I was wondering about the fundamental objectives. Are they going to be included in what you anticipate sending to the governor? There was a lot of great information. I was just trying to keep up with it. And to what degree will they later be informed by new information?
So I would love to, we can either move that, I have a few slides on that very issue to come right after this section. So if there aren't, let's just give folks one more second to see if there are any other questions on this part. And then I hope to get a chance for you and others to make comments on the fundamental objectives.
Yeah, so we wanted to frame the whole timeline and what the role of fundamental objectives really look like in context of the timeline before going back to review them.
Yeah, That makes sense.
Any further questions on this piece? And with that, I'll hand it back over to Charles.
Okay, thanks. And so thank you, Mr. Daniels, for suggesting we move on to in this direction. I am, these are so important to how we kind of make decisions through this process that Lindsay just walked us through. And so I wanted to bring this back up, and I think that they are really important to this. And I have them marked as, kind of for discussion for this group in terms of whether we include them in the interim report or not. And so just to kind of remind us again, these fundamental objectives are kind of our essential goals of the effort, and they're going to guide the development and the evaluation of the actions and the strategies. And Lindsay was really did a great job of kind of showing us how and where these will be used. And these were previewed at our December meeting. We've done a little bit of work since then to kind of regroup them under the categories that you see above. So these aren't the objectives; these are the categories of objectives that I'm showing right here. These are the list of fundamental objectives that I'm going to be kind of walking us through. It's a composite list, so it's the totality of objectives raised by all the members, all the different conversations, the different sectors, the different advisory groups, and they probably don't make sense thinking about them as coming from one particular individual or one particular perspective in the process. The idea is that it's trying to capture this global understanding of what it means to evaluate Louisiana's climate policy. So it's broad on purpose, I think, and I think really useful. So I would also point out too that what's not in here are what we're calling means objectives, kind of the how to get to these points. Those have started emerging. A lot of the members of the committees and advisory groups and the task force are eager to kind of start getting on that. We've recorded those. Those are in process, in progress. But those aren't going to be included in any way in kind of what we're proposing for the interim report. We know that that's not where we want to focus for where we are in the process here. So just to kind of quickly kind of just show the kind of the broad spectrum here. The ultimate goal of the task force is to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions in Louisiana, and we will consider all means by which those can be reduced or captured or sequestered. But there are also a lot of other fundamental objectives that have emerged from the task force committees and advisory groups and I wanted to present them all on one page at first, kind of just to put them all in context. And this is all, a holistic view of what we're trying to accomplish. There is a lot of breadth here. I think there is a desire amongst our membership to improve the quality of life for residents and communities, to create a more equitable society, to ensure the short and long-term success of whatever strategies we adopt. There is a desire to strengthen the economy and the workforce as we do this work, and to conserve and protect the environment, and also to adapt to climate change that we're already seeing the impacts from. So again, the ways that, or the ability of a proposed climate action to meet these different fundamental objectives is going to be evaluated through our process. So these are all going to be, and then also reported transparently. I think it's important to remember. So we'll see how well each proposal does at hitting each of the different boxes that are inside these different categories. So the previous slide just looked at the categories of fundamental objectives, and now I'm going to walk through the objectives themselves. These aren't new to the group. Like I said, we mostly just recategorized, just moved around what box we had them under from last time. These are a synthesis of what came up across all our different meetings. And so again, reducing net greenhouse gas emissions is the first one that came up across all committees. We want to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, and we want to maximize our ability to capture and sequester those. And as I mentioned, through all means, and that's the means are going to come through whether it's nature or engineered solutions, all of the above. Those are the means objectives, and so we're focusing on just this idea of minimizing what is emitted and maximizing what we can capture. Another set of the objectives that came out was to managing for our short and long-term successes. And so to do that well, We want to be able to maximize the confidence of the public and stakeholders in the outcomes of the emissions reduction strategies that will help increase the support for their implementation. Maximizing the efficiency and effectiveness of emissions reduction strategies is important. Maximizing the timely implementation of emissions reduction strategies was raised, and so was maximizing the durability of emissions reduction strategies in an uncertain future. So those were all things that were lifted up under this category we created for managing for short and long-term successes. And those are the ones that kind of relate most directly to the emissions themselves. And then we've got some other fundamental objectives. This one is for improving the quality of life for residents and communities. And this is where we want to maximize the quality of and access to essential goods, services, and infrastructure for residents. We want to maximize the positive public health outcomes and public safety as we do this work. We want to be able to also maximize the preservation of cultural heritage. So all these came up under this category that we created, kind of quality of life for residents and communities. The next one is we kind of grouped under this heading of creating a more equitable society. And so we heard from our different groups that reducing socioeconomic, demographic, and geographic disparities in future opportunities and outcomes was a fundamental objective. Maximizing the reduction and mitigation of historic and structural inequities and their impacts for underserved and marginalized communities, including communities of color and indigenous peoples, was an important fundamental objective. Maximizing engagement with and participation of communities in the decision-making and implementation process was also a fundamental objective raised through our different conversations. The next two, we had a fundamental objective on strengthening the economy and the workforce. And so there we saw folks really highlight the need to maximize job creation and the support for Louisiana workers through that process, as well as maximizing economic growth was a highlighted under that category as well. And conserving natural resources and protecting the environment was a fundamental objective category that we came up with, where we want to maximize the preservation of natural resources and ecosystem services and maximize environmental stewardship and support of healthy ecosystems. And then last but not least, we had a category of fundamental objectives. We headed adapting to climate change, and that we see increase the resilience of the built and natural environment to climate change was a fundamental objective, as was increasing the resilience of communities to climate change. And so here again is our full list of categories, kind of that breadth again, where we've got both emissions specific ones and also kind of the co-benefits type focused, whether they're economic, environmental, or community related. We don't need to take action on this today. We do have time to kind of refine these as we go forward, I think, but they are in good enough shape, I think, for them to be useful and to kind of give a sense to this group and the public, kind of the breadth of concerns that we all have and things that we want to be able to weigh as we move through this. And so I want to just ask the chair if you wanted to open it up for any kind of discussion or comment on this section for inclusion in the interim report, or how you wanted to handle that.
Yeah, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Lindsay, for giving that thorough explanation of both timeline, process, and these fundamental objectives. And I guess I'll start by going back to Mr. Daniels, your question about sort of the role of fundamental. If I'm remembering correctly, is it that you're wondering about the need to adopt them today versus in the future? To what extent are they malleable in the future, can be modified? And yeah, so this is a snapshot in time. It is important to be on the same page as a body about what these fundamental, the task force's fundamental objectives are. But this is an iterative process. And so if we identify a fundamental objective that is not on here or need to tweak it based on further discussions, based on developing emissions reduction strategies, that is certainly up to the will of this task force, and that is certainly something. They're not set in stone in that sense.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually think you guys helped answer the question I had when I saw how thorough the presentation was on the timeline and the deliverables, and how important the fundamental objectives are to everything else that follows in the sequence and the SDM. It just made me think, because we've made so much progress on it now, but I know that in real time, there's new information emerging both from the advisory groups as well as the actual committees, you know, knowing that we'll be able to go back and make some tweaks or make some adjustments based on what the science or the evidence of economic disposition and those different things say is going to be important. And I appreciate Charles suggesting that, you know, we don't have to move these forward right now. We do have some time. I think in the next few weeks, there's an opportunity to really sharpen them and move them forward. And I certainly would love for the task force members to make that consideration.
Thank you. Great points. Are there any other questions or comments with respect to fundamental objectives and
I have a question.
yes.
This is Terry Chambers. My question is not one of whether the objectives are good objectives, but a question of scope. The last one, adapting to a changing climate. The question that I have is whether that's within the scope of this task force, because it seems to me like that could get into coastal restoration and that sort of thing. And it's my impression from the executive order, section 6, that the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority Board shall consider the recommendations of the task force for inclusion in the comprehensive plan for a sustainable coast. So it seems to me like there's a broader plan that our efforts, in my assessment, should be focused on the reduction of emissions and have that become part of a larger plan for a sustainable coast. So my only concern is if we were to allow this task force to lose its focus on reducing emissions as opposed to restoring the coastline, I think that would dilute our efforts.
That's a great point, and I think the intent of this fundamental objective is to inform emissions reduction strategies. And so I'm thinking in particular, our coastal wetlands, restoring our coast while reducing emissions or sequestering emissions has the ability to also increase resilience of communities and rebuild our natural environment. And so we should factor that in as another positive or co-benefit of sequestering through our wetlands. And so I think that's the intent of these fundamental objectives in particular, is just that we're not blind to that aspect. Also, if there's an emissions reduction strategy that I guess they need to be developed in the context of a changing coast with respect to climate change. And so we don't want to put forward recommendations that result in maladaptation as well. And so I think that's what these objectives in particular are getting at. They're not, so if there's they wouldn't allow for sort of that mission creep into activities that build adaptation or resilience, but that don't actually reduce emissions.
Harry, this is Eric Calavote. I brought that same issue up that Terry brought up last time, and we need to be real clear about that if it's something that has to do with adaptation, where adaptation is like a co-benefit, but the purpose of the initiative is GHG reduction. So if it's, we do coastal restoration and that's a sequestration strategy for reducing emissions, that's fine, but you can very easily get off track, as Terry was mentioning, and get up into all kinds of other stuff that really has nothing to do with what our task force is about. At least then that's in my view.
Mm-hmm. No, I hear you, and I think I like to describe the first two fundamental objectives about reducing emissions and maximizing sequestration as the ultimate fundamental objectives. I mean, they are higher up, in the role of their importance and in guiding this work. And so, yes, I think all of these fundamental objectives are viewed through the scope of reducing emissions or increasing sequestration. And so the intent is to ensure that, I mean, certainly all of these other fundamental objectives are on somebody's mind because they were raised already as important things to consider as we are considering how to reduce or emissions or increase sequestration. And so we just want to make sure that we are as upfront about it and clear about it on the front end, because I think that will help identify potential issues and work through any issues if they're identified early enough, as opposed to things, certain fundamental objectives not being addressed and only realizing that at the end of the process.
Harry?
Yes.
So thank you so much to you and the entire team. I think you all have done a remarkable job, and thank you for responding to the comments and discussions with task force members. I just wanted to emphasize the importance of continuing to underpin with the adaptation piece, because a lot of times the mitigation and adaptation recommendations are one and the same. The ways in which we mitigate are also a lot of the recommendations for adapting in the future, especially within the land use, housing, and building sectors. And then I wanted to ask a question. We continue to discuss the reduction of greenhouse gases as the main objective, and in the first bullet, it uses the word net. And so I'd like you to just consider removing the word net, that could be further explained in the follow-up and details under that broad reduction of greenhouse gas emissions objective.
Thank you for those comments. And Charles, or do you mind going back just so I understand your comment? And just, I think, one forward, or do you mind elaborating on which one you're talking about?
Yeah, why are we including the word net? Aren't we focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
The executive order outlines reducing net greenhouse gas emissions. So that includes minimizing greenhouse gas emissions as well as maximizing capture and sequestration. And that's from the executive order, that we're drawing from as part of our charge. Any other comments on the fundamental objectives?
Yeah, I have just a couple of comments. Thanks a lot.
Yes,
This is terrific work. It's terrific work, incidentally. I have a comment about the scope of adaptation. I agree that we have to be very careful about mission creep. I do think that on the mention, for instance, of maladaptive strategies, that's something I think we need to really pay attention to, because a lot of things that might be helpful in reducing carbon might also be things that directly conflict with the health of the wetlands. If we're talking about pipeline networks, for instance, that might be used in sequestration, artificial sequestration, or if we're talking about transmission lines, which we need to bring in more green energy. The building of transmission lines, building of any kind of infrastructure, which we're going to need for various projects to reduce carbon. Those things might also compete with wetlands integrity and things like that. And if we don't have somewhere in here that says we're supposed to be looking at adaptive strength, then there's no way for us to think about those things and balance them. And a second point I have, which is that I think one of the, and I'm not sure what to do about this, but there's a use of the word minimize and maximize a lot in these issues. And theoretically, that might make sense, but there's no practical way that you can both maximize something and that are competing against each other. I mean, if you're going to maximize greenhouse, if you're going to maximize reduction, and you're going to maximize adaptation or resilience, you may not be able to maximize both of those things at the same time. And so I think we all know that. I think we know that what we're going to be talking about here at some point are trade-offs and balances. But if we build it in this way, it's setting us up for never accomplishing what we're saying we're going to accomplish, because you can't maximize everything on a balance sheet.
And the intent of these fundamental objectives is not to, I mean, maybe there is one that checks off all the boxes, but I think, there likely is no silver bullet to this. And therefore, we're going to have to make that, that we have towards the end of the year, that trade-off analysis of, and trying to, that's the work of this task force, is to try to pull in as many co-benefits, avoid as many negative impacts as possible, and come up with that right calibration, or that right suite of different recommendations. That's really the work of this task force. But by listing it out, I think it should help put it front of mind and understand how we are scoring effectively these different emission reduction actions or strategies.
All right, this is Colette. I wanted to make a couple of comments as well. I also just want to thank the staff. This is really great work and a great overview. There are a couple of things that came up for me specifically around the mission creep conversation. I just want to make sure that we're all acknowledging that the impacts of climate change go way past our coast. We're looking at increased temperatures across the state of Louisiana. We're looking at flooding that stops the planting of agriculture. We're looking at things that are impacting our entire state. So I do agree with the comment, like we should stay focused. I agree with the comments there, but I also just want us to acknowledge that the impact of climate change is not just on the coast. And let's all, I believe when we had our presentation, it was pretty obvious just how far those reaches went. So totally clear and agreed on where the CPRA needs to take its lead, but I just wanted to acknowledge that as a part of this. And then also going to Professor Verchek's last comments, when we think about maximizing and minimizing, I ask to what extent? And there seems to be missing a clause or a phrase here. Of course, our goal as a task force is to help figure out the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And I also agree with taking out net, but I understand the executive order. There's a conversation to be had there. But the broader point I wanted to make is to what extent, to maximize things, to what extent? I think we should have at least a beacon or a standpoint that we want to maximize and minimize things to the benefit of Louisiana's people and to the benefit of Louisiana's communities, which is not the same thing as sort of, an industry or our economy. It's a broader set of dimensions here. So I want to sort of bring in a little caution as we maximize and minimize the best we can to really think about the end result here. And the end result isn't a piece of paper, it's our state and it's the communities of our state. And we want to make sure we keep those in mind.
Great points, certainly. Yes, climate change is impacting state, the whole state. And my example about the coast was just to try to, it's something that I'm more familiar with. But certainly we'll be looking at adaptation, through the lens of greenhouse gas reduction strategies, certainly. And I think that we do need to, just by removing it from the list, doesn't mean it isn't going to be considered. And so I think that's what we're trying to do is just put it all on paper and to have it be known. Otherwise, some folks are going to be thinking about adaptation and it will influence the conversation, but it won't be as transparent. And then to the point about the vision, and I think this task force can help elaborate and build on that vision. It was outlined by the governor in his executive order as part of this task force is charged to develop policies, strategies, and incentives designed to achieve net emissions reduction targets established in this order while improving the health and welfare of the people of Louisiana and advancing Louisiana's economic energy profile. So that is the vision set out by the governor. I think we can build on that and flesh it out. But certainly, yeah, to what end, I think that's an important question to ask.
I have another question. It's related to the idea of net greenhouse gas emission, the definition of that. I'm not sure, I haven't seen anything in the materials that we have that has explained or described what we mean by greenhouse gas emissions. I know that in scientific studies and in policy work in various states in the US and abroad, there are different ideas about what emissions we're talking about. And I'm thinking mainly about upstream, but some upstream, but mainly downstream emissions. So for instance, liquid fuels that we produce that we know are going to be combusted somewhere else, or an activity that we might align with that we know is going to create maybe more traffic or more consumption of fossil fuel related to more combustion. Some states take those things into account. Are we planning on doing that? Has the governor set any kind of definition that we have to follow, or is that part of what we're trying to decide ourselves?
That is not included in the executive order. I think that is something for this task force to look at and decide, the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The greenhouse gas emissions inventory that LSU is doing looks primarily at scope 1, the emissions that are being generated and are combusted generally, at least in Louisiana. Certainly, I think it makes sense for, in particular, some of the committees to look at the carbon footprint of the built environment, for example, and understand opportunities. If the world is going to reduce emissions, those products for the built environment are going to have to change, and so it is also thinking about those that transition and what are some opportunities for the state to take advantage of economically, for example. And I think for the scope 3, I think it's also thinking through the larger macroeconomics and understanding that level as well. But I think that's something for this task force to dig into a little further. There's questions about double counting emissions, and so I think first and foremost, getting Louisiana's emissions in order, from those generated or produced here in state, it should be perhaps the first order, but not to put blinders on. And certainly,
you mean the ones that are emitted in the state, not the ones that are.
I think that's at least where the greenhouse gas inventory that it has been, and I think to the extent we can bring in additional resources to understand carbon footprint, those scope 2 and scope 3 as well, just to paint a full picture. Of the landscape, I think is important. But to the extent we're talking about those reduction goals, the intent was to focus on those emissions being emitted in Louisiana.
One thing you might keep in mind too, if you haven't looked at the inventory that was done before, it's interesting reading. It doesn't take that long. There's a lot of sources, including natural sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just combustion of fossil fuels. There's a lot of other sources as well.
Certainly, and in terms of those different types of greenhouse gases, I think we're using the EPA standard, and I don't have don't have the ability to rattle them off right now, but includes NOx and certain other, the fluorocarbon family as well.
Mr. Chairman, this is Tyler Gray, and I appreciate your comments around the carbon footprint and differentiating between that. And hearing sort of the dialogue today, I do agree with the concept and where you're going with that, which is differentiating between what you've called a carbon footprint and making sure that when we discuss this, Louisiana is a energy export state. So when you're looking at this, there's energy that's produced here that may go to other places and fuel the whole East Coast. So I think it is worth considering, really focusing on that reduction aspect of it, really driving down those reductions, because the net will cause more challenges going forward. So, as long as we can differentiate that and sort of what the analysis is, the difference between a net reduction and a reduction, because the carbon capture will really have an impact, a tremendous impact. And we just don't want to lose out on that opportunity by not clarifying the difference between net reduction and reduction. But I agree with your points.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Harry,
Yes.
And to follow up on Tyler's point, I think it is an important distinction, and also to include one way that many states are reducing greenhouse gases are diversifying their energy sources. And so I think if we're talking about maximizing and minimizing, we should at least look into and understand the opportunities within renewables.
Thank you for that comment as well.
Yeah, Harry, I'm sorry. This is Virginia
Yes,
Burke.
Dr. Burkett.
Yes, this downstream impact of fossil fuels produced in Louisiana. Okay, and Dr. Verchek and a couple other people mentioned that as being important. And just we did this for federal lands at the USGS. We did an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions from federal lands, but we started looking at, from the activity itself. And there's a way that you can do the downstream wherever it is combusted. We have a methodology for that, and it's possible, but I would not attempt to do that in this time frame that we have. We do not have time to do this in the same way that we had 3 or 4 years to do it for federal lands, where we looked at the carbon footprint of all the oil, coal, natural gas from federal lands. We have done that for the United States. It's 20% of all the land in the country. But it took us a long time to do that, and to do it with credibility and with scientific the methods that we used. I would suggest that maybe we talk about things in the future that would be good to do, and that would be maybe for the next iteration of this climate plan that we're putting together. It is possible to do it, and but I wouldn't distract us now, knowing how hard it was to do that for oil, natural gas, and coal produced on federal lands. It's possible, but it takes more time. And another point, the fundamental objectives that reducing net greenhouse gas emissions, if you look in the report itself, the draft report, it's got 2 bullets there. Maybe we ought to bring in those 2 bullets if it makes people trip up over the net and what that means. Maximizing greenhouse gas emissions and maximizing greenhouse gas capture and sequestration. So, maybe splitting that bullet into 2, but you explain later in the document exactly what that is, and it does make sense, that the concept of net emissions reduction. So just 2 comments.
Thank you, Dr. Burkett. And yes, to clarify, the bullets in the black text are the fundamental objectives, and so the net is just a heading to capture the actual fundamental objectives of increasing and decreasing.
Mr. Chairman, this is Flozell Daniels. Thank you, Dr.
Yes.
Burkett, for that point of clarity. Is it appropriate, Mr. Chair, to formalize the point that Dr. Burkett made, that we can either make a motion or put on a timeline what it might look like to begin to trigger that deeper analysis that Dr. Burkett is telling us will rightly take some time. I think it's similar to your point about the coastal plan. There were some things initially that we knew would take years, but we still decided we would pursue those measurements so that by the time we got to that work, we had the advantage of that information.
Mhm.
I would certainly like us to consider what it would look like to put that on a timeline that matches the urgency that we're moving with everything else.
If you certainly, if you'd like to make a motion, I'm not sure it's certainly what you're suggesting or proposing, but if you would.
Yeah, I'm not sure it requires a motion, and maybe other members of the task force can weigh in, but I think Dr. Burkett was saying that based on their experience, they know it's a very complex process to do the full encompassing analysis, and I do think it's something we need. Louisiana leads in a bunch of things, some of them great and some of them not so great. I just would want us to put that on the timeline sooner rather than later so we can get some sense. Is that something we can have access to 3 years from now? Or is it a two-year engagement? Or we may not know. And maybe the science advisory group needs to come back to us at the next meeting with a better sense of what's possible. But it just really resonated with me that information is needed and it's difficult to measure. And I think we should have a clear understanding of how we get there.
Okay, great. Thanks for elaborating. And Dr. Burkett, do you think that is something that the science would be appropriate for the science advisory group to weigh in on, or to refer to Dr. Dismukes, who's preparing the inventory to kind of help develop those thoughts on what that scope of work would look like? Certainly staff can look into it. And so certainly we'll move it somewhere, but in terms of how we go about it.
Yeah, making it perhaps a recommendation, of that will go in our report for further work down the road, just not losing that Mr. Daniels, like you said, just capturing that as something that needs to be done, but wasn't possible in the time that we were given or the resources. Just as a recommendation.
Harry,
Yes, let's go through.
Number one, wonderful work. Thank you. And I'm wondering if it's appropriate for the science team to take a crack at a general scope that the task force could look at, describing what that further analysis would look at. And as Dr. Burkett said, putting that in the final report, but just having a little more detail. If you wanted to look at that, you need to consider A, B, C, D in a little more detail, but not actually do the work during this interim time, but help to frame it for the next iteration.
I think that's a great recommendation, and certainly staff can work with you, Dr. Burkett and Dr. Zappi, on certainly, I think this has been a very productive conversation. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. You just cut out.
Professor.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this is really fruitful. And I wonder if some of this information in some form is already available in the private sector. And that would be something to think about, because I know that a lot of energy companies do this sort of these inventories internally, and I don't know what they would have or how useful it would be for us, but that's one idea. The other thing I wanted to do, just in terms of sort of framing the issue, I do want to push back a little bit on the idea that our charge has to do with emissions that come within the boundaries of Louisiana. And the reason is not just the downstream, but also the upstream. So for instance, if we had the chance, just hypothetically, to change some of the electricity that we buy from Texas, and if we made the choice to buy more electricity from Texas, assuming we could, that was from wind rather than from fossil fuel burning, making that choice wouldn't do anything about the amount of GHGs that were emitted within the state of Louisiana, but they would do a lot about about the effects of climate change, perhaps. And it's not, the distinction really, I don't think, is about what state boundaries the GHGs come out of. I think it's about what GHGs are within our control. We have control about, theoretically, where we buy our electricity and what kind of electricity we buy. We have control over how much liquid energy or liquid fuel that we produce and where it's sold and intended for combustion. So if we have control over something, then it's arguable that we should know about what we're doing with what we have control over and what the results are to the environment of what we have control over. If we don't have control over something, then we, it's hard to make an argument that we should be inventorying it.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point, and certainly we recognize this is a global effort. We are all in it together, and so to put blinders on and artificially limit ourselves and not consider the global dynamics, global markets. For example, if we, production were to decrease in Louisiana, does that actually change, the amount of gasoline that is used around the country?
I don't know, and I don't know the answer.
Exactly. So I think there's no. This has been a very fruitful conversation, and I think that question about scope of greenhouse gas emissions is ripe for additional discussion as we move along, for sure. But I do want to be mindful of time. Are there any comments on fundamental objectives? It sounds like this has been a very fruitful conversation. Mr. Calavoda?
Yeah, I just want to point out, not to be contrary, but I don't think we should be expanding our scope. I would point out, we can say that the downstream effects of all the home heating oil that we sell in the Northeast, nobody's forcing those people to buy it. And they need to come up with their own GHG reduction strategy in Massachusetts and Maine and New York and places that buy that home heating oil from us. If we start doing that, there's no end to the scope of this thing. It just gets way out of control. And I just think in the time frame we have, we need to really just focus on that, the inventory that was done before and that will be redone and available in July, which is really what is emitted within the boundaries of Louisiana and how can we reduce that. And if we stick to that, I think we'll have a higher chance of success. If we get carried away and start trying to reach out in the upstream and downstream aspects of this, then we're not going to finish in a year. I can tell you that. It's going to take a lot longer. So I would argue that we just need to stick with our original scope.
Yeah, thank you for those comments, Dr. Calavoda. Ms. Gotro?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask a process question, since this has changed a little bit in terms of what the expectations were for what we would be providing to the governor. Do we need a motion or something formalizing the desire of the task force? And if there are other comments on the topic, like to hear them, but I'll be glad to make a motion if you need one, or how do y'all plan on proceeding?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Gotro. I was planning to, I think we've had a very good conversation about fundamental objectives. I think there's more conversation to be had, more refinement, public input. And so, I think tabling the fundamental objectives and not including them in that report. But Charles, do you have a slide kind of outlining the topics for consideration? Because
I do. So
thank you.
This is the full topics for consideration. We didn't have as much of a committee advisory group report. We had a section in the draft that was circulated to the task force that included some of that. I would just say that even more so than the fundamental objectives, those are a snapshot in time, kind of report out there. Those committees only had one meeting, and so that was we scratched the surface there. And so I think, not to belabor the point, because I know we are running short on time, but on that one, there's it's also in green, because is the committee or is the task force comfortable kind of putting those forward as as it is now? This is the discussion that was had, these are the issues that were brought up, knowing that they can be further improved over time, or should they just be kind of left off as well? And so just with that minor addition, the ones in black are the ones we're proposing including, and then the two in green are the ones that we kind of raised for discussion. So that's kind of what the question is, I think, for the task force.
Is it staff's recommendation to include all the ones in the black letters and then perhaps a qualified committee and advisory group reports where it's more of a overview of the discussions had and topics of discussion, as opposed to, I know those committee reports, they framed the charge in particular as this is the charge, appearing to be set in stone or more finalized. But is it the recommendation that we frame that more as, this is the current status of the discussions of those committees and their charge?
Yes, that is what we would propose doing.
Okay, and Ms. Gotro, is that your motion to adopt the staff's recommendation?
My only question is, everyone comfortable? It sounds like the synthesized fundamental objectives are not going to be included. I'm just wondering really quickly from the committee chairs if they're comfortable. I'd be comfortable if this is the status of our advisory committee.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to me.
So that will be my motion, that we take staff recommendations and include a status report on the committee and advisory group reports to frame the summary that's provided to the governor, and that should be in a letter from the chair of the task force.
I'll second the motion.
We have a motion by Ms. Gotro, a second by Ms. Manning-Broom. Any additional discussion from the members? Hearing none. I don't know if I have the ability to see if it's now time for public comment. And Lindsay or Charles, are you able to see if folks' hands are raised? And can you call on them?
Okay, we can do that. I think so. If we open it for public comment, we can see hands from the attendees.
Okay.
Lindsay, stop me if you think I'm wrong, but I think we can.
Yeah, you should be able to if anyone raises a hand.
And Charles and Lindsay, you can also publish the comments in the chat or Q&A too, if you want.
Yes, if anybody would like to write their comments, but if anybody would like to speak their comments as well, both options are available. We have
There's
one comment
raised.
from Mr. Arthur Abear. I watched the whole interaction and don't have any immediate questions. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, we do have one raised hand. I'll go ahead and.
Okay. This is Eric Smith. For those who don't know, I'm on the advisory committee for science. 2 points to make. One is that we need to, I think, establish sort of a baseline in terms of policy. This is something EIA does on a regular basis. They refuse to forecast anything that's not already established as policy. And once the policy changes, they're able to go forward. My concern is that we have a change of administration and we'll have a number of at least regulatory rules changed over the next couple of years. And any one of those rules could seriously impact on our assumptions and our conclusions. So if it's not been established, I would suggest that we come up with some sort of a statement, at least for the federal regulatory environment, that establishes what our baseline will be. My other comment was very simple. There's a lot of concern about using net emissions. In many cases, when we start looking at reducing emissions in petrochemical plants and refineries, et cetera, downstream, you're going to actually increase emissions at one location and decrease them at another. And your net emissions is the difference between the two. So there's virtually nothing you can do in a refinery or a chemical plant that doesn't increase the emissions in some location, but overall your net emissions will go down. So optimizing is one recommendation that sort of gets around this argument about net versus absolute emissions. That's it.
Thank you for your comment, Mr. Smith. Lindsay and Charles, is the board clear? Any other comments? Clear. All right, and I will note before we vote that Jeff Schwartz, Joey Bro, and Professor Verchek are all now in attendance, and so they're just let the record reflect that. And so we have the motion to adopt the proposed interim report that staff is recommending. There's a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, passes. Thank you all very much. So now we will be moving. Staff will prepare that for the chair, and the chair will send that to the governor and appropriate other bodies, oversight committees, and the CPRA board before the 1st. And so with that, we are ready to move to the next agenda item, the action template overview. So back to Mr. Sutcliffe and Ms. Cooper.
Sorry, everyone, I was muted. So now we're going to go into an overview of the action template that I had mentioned in the overview of process. This is what will really carry sector committees and the public through identifying different emission reduction actions that should be taken by committees, and also cross-cutting strategies as well. So this will be critical in the next step to be used by all of these different developers. Of course, the members of our groups, the committees, advisory groups, and task force will be developers of this, but we also encourage state agencies, the governor's office, organizations as an entity, and members of the public as well to also be developers of actions that reduce emissions and encourage use of sinks across sectors. So the task force climate report, as I mentioned, will be based on these actions, meaning that the report will compile multiple actions through strategies and their implementation pathways that set us on the road to meeting our goal of net zero by 2050. So Harry sent you all this action template last Monday that identifies the consistent format that each of the actions will follow. We realized that we offered a lot of questions. 27 questions on 10 pages is a lot for developing actions, but we want to ensure that we take a very thorough approach in developing this part of the process. But with that, I'd also say we encourage you, if you can't complete the template, and we know in some instances it might not even be possible to complete the template, we still want you to submit the action proposals to our staff, even if there are only a few questions answered or not all of the details can be filled in. So first I'll identify what we mean by action. So we've defined an action as a specific policy, program, or project that results in a net reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and or comprehensively addresses a cross-cutting implementation priority. And these are our 4 advisory areas of climate equity, economic transition, scientific advancement, and governance. So that's what we're looking for, focused on in this action template. In this solicitation timeline, as I referenced in the meeting schedule will run from the joint meeting in February through the joint meeting in April. And so with this, I'll move into an overview of the different sections of this template. So the template's laid out under 6 headers. We take some time to explain what an action is and what the actions will be used for. There are also some instructions on how we expect the template to be filled out and used. And then we ask for an overview of the proposed actions. What are the anticipated impacts, the feasibility, and then possible implementation pathway of this as well. So I'll go through most of the questions in these sections verbatim, just in case there are any tweaks to language that members would like to offer. We did receive some great feedback from all of you on these questions, and so I've highlighted them in red. Any changes and additions that we've made from the draft sent to you last Monday, I'll highlight those so you can see where those changes have been made. And if needed, we can make additional tweaks as seen fit. So please flag for me at the end of each slide if there are any questions or concerns around that. So as I mentioned, the first section is the overview of proposed action. This will outline who is proposing the action, what entity it is, if there's been coordination or collaboration with committee members or advisory members or task force members. And we do encourage collaboration even among different committee members and among public and committee stakeholders. So we then ask for a descriptive title for the action, a brief description in 1 or 2 paragraphs on the overview of the action, the policy, project, or program that you're proposing. And in the 4th question, we ask what sector emission sources or sinks are targeted. And so this lays out just the different committees that we have and also offers at the end an option for identifying an action that doesn't directly reduce net emissions, but comprehensively addresses cross-cutting implementation priorities. So factoring that in from the beginning. And then we ask what type of greenhouse gas is targeted by the action. And so this includes carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases, and then an option if none of those are applicable. So this is just setting the stage and offering some pretty simplistic questions on what the action is offered. Members, do we have any comments on this initial section?
Lindsay, Virginia here. I'm just worried, and when I'm sure it's been, y'all are thinking about this, but the emissions address, the target, how much, how the proposer is quantifying the impacts of the proposed action, the metrics they use, or are you expecting that the task force will then pick up the action and put the numbers to it? Or does the people, either the sectoral committee or the public member, the public contributors, do they calculate the impact in terms of CO2 equivalents? Who does that?
That's a great question, Dr. Burkett. And we reference that in the first question on the impact section, which comes next, that asks how your action reduces the emissions in Louisiana. So we would like for the proposers to identify, as best as they know, identify what type of emission reduction can be anticipated from this action to help us understand sort of the magnitude of the emission reduction potential, but understanding that it might not be the most updated data, or we might have to supplement that expertise, but asking from their perspective and why they're putting it forward, what they think that impact might be.
Where would we even get an idea of what that would be?
I think understanding some of the best practices from other states, we can anticipate what an emission reduction potential might look like. So if someone is proposing a best practice that they've seen implemented across other industrial states, then it's possible that that could be transferred or just offered here as kind of a ballpark. We won't use that as our official understanding of its emission reduction potential, but more so letting them offer what they see as the best science and data on that. With no further questions, I'll move to the impact section. We broke this down into a few different categories to understand, as we had just spoken to, the emission reduction potential of proposed actions and the co-benefits as well. So the sixth question asked, how does your action reduce Louisiana's greenhouse gases? How do you know this? And do you have quantifiable evidence or research on how we can examine the emissions associated with your actions? So just to reiterate what Dr. Burkett had asked, this is having the proposers of actions identify if they see or know of any quantifiable evidence that we can use as we're examining the emission reduction potential of the proposed action. And then we also, in trying to understand the impacts, want to consider the co-benefits that are presented through these actions. So question 7 says that emissions don't happen by themselves. They impact our lives, health, economy, and culture. What other benefits does the proposed action have? How do these co-benefits help achieve fundamental objectives of the task force? Describe the significance of these co-benefits and potential ways to measure them. Another question under co-benefits is, through an equity lens, what groups primarily benefit from this action? Are there ways to ensure more equitable access to these benefits? How can traditionally marginalized communities be prioritized in distribution of benefits? How will the proposed action improve equity in the state? And how do marginalized populations benefit from the action? And we recognize this is a lot of different questions under co-benefits. And again, fully accept any proposals that can't answer all of these questions, but realizing that it's one of our key advisory areas, we want to look through our actions with an equity lens and understanding the co-benefits of those actions and the ability to further other fundamental objectives of the task force. Also on impacts, we wanted to think through the negative consequences that could result from the proposed action. So we have 3 questions that fall under this. Question 9 is, what are potential negative consequences associated with implementing these actions? How might these negative consequences impact the fundamental objectives? Describe the significance of these negative consequences and potential ways to measure them. The 10th question, again, through that equity lens, who primarily bears the burden of potential negative consequences? Is the burden placed disproportionately on specific groups, particularly lower income, minority, indigenous, or rural communities? Does this burden exacerbate historic or structural inequities? Are there ways this burden can be mitigated or distributed more equitably? And then question 11 asks, what are potential concerns with transferring emissions or negative consequences to other states? And how can we mitigate this as well? So looking at these 2 slides of the impacts to proposed actions, do we have any questions, members, on understanding the impacts?
I don't have any questions, Lindsay. This is Colette, but I'll just say I'm really glad to see this question in here, just as we consider how to get equity throughout this recommendation. So excellent.
Absolutely.
I have a technical question, and simply, I tried to.
Mr. Smith, I hate to cut you off. We're just opening up to member questions, and then we'll open it up to public comment towards the end, once we, if there's a motion on the table. Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Any further questions, members? And you can see from the red lines and striped questions how we've amended based on feedback that we received from you all in the past week. With no further questions, we'll move to the section on feasibility. So we've also broken this down under a few headers to understand best available science and technology, supportive infrastructure, and proven success. This goes back to what I had mentioned earlier to Dr. Burkett and Dr. Calavoda, trying to determine what research data and expertise support this action, or possibly do we need further research data and needed understanding for this action, its reduction potential or potential challenges before adoption. This one is opening up to possibly any supporting data and research or the need for further research and data. And as I mentioned in the conversation around workflow, we're very cognizant that many actions that can be taken might require further research. And knowing that this is only year one of our effort, it's important to start identifying those areas that need further research in this year. In question 13, looking more towards supporting investments, does this action require supporting investments in infrastructure or other systems to work? If so, can those investments support other greenhouse gas reduction actions? And then 2 questions that will help us see if this has been implemented elsewhere. Understanding its proven success will be really helpful to our team, and I think also the committees in understanding the actions. So question 14 notes, has this action been successfully implemented elsewhere? And then 15 is, does this action build on existing successful efforts in Louisiana? And with that, members, are there any questions on the feasibility?
I have a question. It occurs to me that particularly with the new administration, that there might be opportunities for resources that would be available from DOE or other places, and there may be resources available from entities outside the federal government. Is there a place where we can ask or should ask about what sorts of resources might be available, sort of financial resources or technical assistance resources that might be available for particular ideas or programs?
I think that's a great question, Professor Burchick. We note in the implementation pathway if this action would require or benefit from other governmental action, including federal, state, or local, but not one explicitly on possible existing resources that we can utilize.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, again, let's say you had, option A and option B, and it turns out that option B had a good chance of getting funding from the Department of Energy or somebody, then that would be something we'd want to consider.
Certainly. And to help answer that, question 24 under funding tries to cover that with what sources are available or could
there we
be
go.
used
Okay.
to fund implementation. So gotcha. Good point. But if that covers it.
Excellent.
It was in there somewhere. Thank you for that comment, Professor. Any further questions on feasibility? Moving on to implementation, this will cover the next few slides. And again, as I mentioned in the workflow, this is really important for us as the planning team and also for you guys as the task force and the subgroups to start thinking through ways that we can implement actions before we even develop them. Understanding what is feasible in Louisiana, but also how do we get there? How do we reach these proposed actions? So we framed a lot of different questions under here. The first one is asking how quickly can the proposed action be implemented or scaled up to meaningfully reduce greenhouse gas emissions, factoring in the time that's needed to develop, design, permit, and construct the potential action. And so the timeframes we give are the short term, which is 0 to 5 years, medium term, which is 5 to 10 years, long term, which is greater than 10 years. And that follows our short, medium, and long term emission reduction goals as well. And will help us understand if this is a near term action that might need to be acted upon more quickly or possibly a longer term solution. And then identifying action leads and partnerships, take us through the next few questions. Question 17 asks what entity would lead adoption and implementation of this action, and who is ultimately responsible for the action's successful reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We divided adoption implementation, knowing that there might be some hurdles to adoption and different hurdles that exist towards implementation. And so who do we need to possibly lead adoption and then separately lead implementation? And in question 18, it asks, who are key public, private, nonprofit, and civic collaborators necessary for successful adoption and implementation? And this differs from question 17, because 17 is asking who is responsible for the action success, and then 18 is what are all of the partnerships that need to be built in order to have successful adoption and implementation. So 18 will likely be a broader response than for 17. And then in 19, does this adoption, implementation, or acceleration require or benefit from government action? And this is where I think it would be helpful in considering local, state, and federal legislation, levels of government responsibilities, potential executive and legislative action, leveraging our governor's term, leveraging the administration, bringing in those outside considerations into this as well. Other components of implementation pathways, alignment with other initiatives is something we mentioned a little bit in the feasibility, but this question asks specifically, how does this action align with and leverage existing efforts, concurrent public or private initiatives, and or existing partnerships? And so this is trying, again, to go back to that question on co-benefits and how we can leverage other efforts that are happening and begin to build on things that are already happening in Louisiana. Question 21 is a fairly broad question. I imagine we'll get some long responses to this, but this is identifying the necessary steps to adopt and implement this action, really getting into the implementation pathway. What do we need to do in order to get this action scaled up? And 22 is describing the potential scientific, legal, economic, and political hurdles associated with successful adoption and implementation of this action. It's fairly clear from this question that even if the proposers can't identify how these challenges could be addressed, these fit pretty well in the advisory areas. So we can have the scientific advisory group, the legal advisory group, the economic advisory group, help think through how we overcome the hurdles that might be associated with adoption, implementation of particular actions. And then also, how do we expand support for the action? How do we grow partnerships? How do we message this better and help to get over those hurdles of adoption? And then we go to funding and implementation. What are the estimated costs to implement this action? Are those costs expected to change over time, and do they change with scale? And what is the basis for the provided estimate? We want the proposer to estimate what this might cost and what implementation and scaling up might be for the state or for the entity responsible, but also understanding what this basis of estimate is. And question 24 is what sources are available or could be used to fund implementation of this action? Going back to Professor Burchick's question, there might already be sources of funding out there that we can leverage.
Are we limited to existing sources of funds?
No, absolutely not limited to existing sources of funds, but obviously feasible funds that could be used to implement. For example, if we're waiting for funding disbursement from a federal resource, then that could be used here, but something that would be feasible for funding. And question 25, we received a few comments on this question being vague, and it might not be best suited for this section of the action template. So we've decided to strike this from the template. But this question reads, what are the anticipated economic impacts from this action? Potential gains or losses in jobs, investment in industries, imports and exports. Are there ways to mitigate potential negative impacts? So we've decided to strike this one from the funding portion of the implementation pathway. And just two more questions on implementation in regard to equitable implementation. So the question 26 asks, given the distribution of cost, benefits, and consequences associated with this action, alongside historic, structural, and geographic context, are there specific equity concerns that should be addressed in how this action is implemented? And this is where our equity advisory group can help address these concerns. And it's helpful to have transparency in identifying potential concerns. As a few slides ago, we recognized on the economic and scientific and legal frame, it's also important on the equitable frame that we recognize potential concerns that can be addressed. And then question 27 asks, what stakeholders or community engagement is recommended to support further development and implementation of this action? Members, that brings us through all the questions of this section on implementation. Are there any questions or comments that you all would like to offer?
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. And I just wanted to add on, thank you for walking us through the action template. I will just piggyback a little on that question. I believe it was 26 that we are recommending striking related to economic impacts. Certainly economic impacts are critical to, we need to understand those impacts of any emissions reduction strategy, but those are fully captured in the other earlier questions relating to positive co-benefits or negative impacts more generally. We just felt that it was, that was sufficiently covered in those earlier questions, and it would lead to, keeping it in would lead to a slippery slope of adding in line by line a lot more questions specifically to potential impacts. And so we thought it'd be best to frame in the context of just generally asking for positive impacts and negative impacts. But with that, thank you again, Lindsay, for walking us through it. As she mentioned earlier, the goal is to approve this template for circulation and to begin accepting public proposals and proposals from the members of the task force, advisory groups, and committees in February. So that is the ultimate goal. I will supplement with the fact that even though we will be reviewing these templates as they are, even if they are partially completed, we want to make sure that the public is allowed to engage at whatever level they're able to engage. And so we will supplement with just one general text box on likely our website to solicit input at a kind of a simpler level where it's just asking for input so that folks aren't intimidated or feel like this 10-page questionnaire is too much to handle. So and with that, if there are no other questions, we'll entertain a motion to adopt the action template subject to the staff's recommendations that were noted in the red that Lindsay identified.
Harry, this is Colette. I certainly would like to make that motion. I also just want to say, right before I do, can we ensure that this form is translated into Vietnamese, Spanish, so that all communities who get access to this, can really participate? I think this is a great document, and I'd like to make a motion that we accept.
No, that's a great point, and I think we'll, if we can work with you and perhaps some other of your partners, that we could ensure that level of accessibility as well. But yes, certainly. So there is a motion on the table to approve the action template subject to staff's recommendations and edits. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Also,
A second by Dr. Calavoda. Any additional discussion from the members?
I would like to make one comment. If we're going to get really ideas from the public and for people who are, perhaps not well versed in this, I think it can be a little intimidating when you ask them to come up with estimates of things. I mean, I don't think we ought to overlook ideas necessarily. If they can't fill out those portions that deal with estimated reductions and things like that, they still might have a good idea that can spark good thinking by people who can come up with estimates. So I think we need to be clear about that you don't have to necessarily fill out everything. Fill out what you can and submit it. There's no bad ideas. The more ideas, the better. So
Certainly. Thank you. I fully agree. And we do clarify that in the instructions, but I think at every opportunity along the way to make it clear that, we will accept incompletes and, we'll take them and consider them and further them along the way. So at this point, if there are no other comments from the members, we will go to public comment. And I know Mr. Smith had a comment, and
Two more.
Charles and Lindsay, can you be sure to also just check the climate@la.gov email?
We do have a few raised hands on the attendee list, so I'm going to unmute Logan Burke.
Say again?
Okay, Mr. Smith.
All right, just a simple request, which is on this form, do you intend for it to be entered electronically, or can people send it in longhand to a particular address? Right now, you can't enter information into it with a computer. So I'm just wondering what the ultimate goal will be when you do open this up in February.
Yes, our goal is to accept digitally as well as via normal regular mail, and so to meet folks at their level.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Any other public comment?
Yes, hi there. This is Logan Burke with the Alliance for Affordable Energy. First, I want to say thank you so much for the efforts here to further engage the public. Of course, this additional webinar option is a much easier way for folks to engage. But this template is really welcome. I want to clarify just a couple of things and then make one suggestion. One is, it looks like, according to the Gantt chart, that this will be open through about May 1st. Do I have that correct?
Yes, Logan, it will run from the first all hands on deck meeting in February through the April all hands on deck meeting, which is at the end of April. So you're right, almost through May.
Okay, great. And then a thought I had, I think obviously this will be up on the landing page website for the governor's task force, but I'm curious if there's if there's an opportunity here maybe for a press release, some way to make sure that the public sees this, the public who isn't necessarily watching closely that governor's landing site. Certainly organizations like the Alliance will be pushing it out, but I just want to make sure that that it has the full-throated support of the governor's office.
Thank you for that comment. Yes, we intend to fully distribute and disseminate. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, I have a couple of notes on the climate email address. They're not specific to an agenda item. They're kind of overall letters. I can read those in or circulate them, however you'd like to.
If we can do that at the end, we're taking public comment specific to the motion on the table with respect to the action template.
Mr. Chairman, we have one more raised hand on the attendee list. I'm going to unmute Alex Kolker.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and thanks so much to this to the task force for all their work today. I do have one sort of question or sort of broad comment on the action form. I wonder if there's a space to put out broad strategies rather than in addition to, that might be composed of multiple individual actions. So for example, one broad strategy that some states and countries are using is to electrify everything and then and then expand the electrical grid to renewable energy. So that broad strategy would involve, turning our cars into electric cars or shifting the fleet to electric fleets, while also changing cook stoves over to electronic cook stoves, while also having heating and air conditioning be done electronically, and then at the same time expanding our portfolio of renewable energy so that these things are powered off of Louisiana supplied solar and wind. So I wonder if there's some space in either this action template or maybe a separate action template to propose broad-based strategies that might be a combination then of multiple individual actions.
Thank you, Dr. Kolker. And I do think that the template accounts for that in terms of policies, and certainly those who wish to propose kind of those broad strategies can still fill out this action form. All right. Any additional comment from the public? All right. Hearing none. All in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, motion carries to have adopted the action template, and we'll begin circulating it. And as soon as we finalize those edits, we will circulate to this group and post on our website in anticipation of the opening of accepting of comments, so that folks have the time to review the questions, think about them, and prepare kind of over the course of this month. Excellent. And so with that, we are now at next steps, and we will be sending a doodle poll right after this meeting to get on your calendars. We are looking at our next meeting, that all hands on deck meeting for the last week of February. And so we'll circulate a poll to find that date, and we'll also be, as I mentioned in my email last week, we'll be looking to, now that we've approved the workflow for the year, that we'll be looking to get on everybody's calendars with calendar holds, so that we can make sure that everybody can attend throughout the year. And so with that, we will now open up to public comment. And Charles, do you want to read those two comments that we've received already, and then we can go to the board?
Okay, I'll start off. This is from Mr. George Bond. He says, "Good day. As one who moved to New Orleans a few years ago, I have seen the need for coastal protection, breaking away from fossil fuel and rebuilding natural hurricane protections. Louisiana loses too many acres of land daily. Part of this is caused by infilled canals put in by the oil companies. They should be filled. Others are due to the loss of land and diversions and other ways to build up land help here. They should be expanded on. Fossil fuel is last century renewables are currently where we should go. Wind farms, pin the Gulf, sun panels for solar, and a switch by cities and other immunities to renewable should be fostered. Natural hurricane barriers can be levees with beachfront, mangrove swamps, and a rebuilding of marshes through grasses and trees. Most efforts to save land also contribute to providing hurricane relief. all if this should be in the master plan so that a coordinated program can be funded and enacted. And that's from George Bond in New Orleans. I have a letter also from Cindy Cutrera from the Port of Morgan City. In this letter to the members of the Louisiana Climate Initiatives Task Force, the Port of Morgan City would like to thank the Climate Initiatives Task Force for serving our great state of Louisiana and for allowing us the opportunity to publicly comment. The Climate Initiatives Task Force webpage states that to improve our resilience, sustain our coast, and help avoid the worst impacts of climate change, Governor John Bel Edwards established the Climate Initiatives Task Force to proactively work to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving up global temperatures, increasing sea level, and other risks that threaten our health and safety, quality of life, economic growth, and vital habitats and ecosystems. Louisiana's economic growth has been dependent upon oil and gas exploration and production since the early 1900s, beginning with the first oil field discovered in commercial quantities 6 miles from Jennings, Louisiana in September 1901. In the coming years, Louisianians worked and earned a good living, laying pipelines, building refineries, learning to drill over water, and making new discoveries. In fact, November 14, 1947, the first oil well out of sight of land was brought in by Kerr McGee in the Gulf of Mexico, about 45 miles south of Morgan City in the Ship Shoal Block 32 field, marking the birth of the offshore oil and gas industry. Our people built offshore platforms and began to travel offshore to install and service these platforms, and service and supply businesses continued to grow. As the oil and gas industry continued to grow, it provided for our state, even our state government, in so many ways. In 1959, severance taxes on oil and gas rose above the $100 million mark in Louisiana for the first time, and by 1982 hit an all-time record of $971,677,140. In 1982, lease and royalty income paid by the oil and gas industry to the state of Louisiana soared to an all-time record of $624,529,812. A study conducted by the Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association in 1993 showed that the offshore oil and gas industry had a positive economic impact on the state of more than $3 billion each year. Through hurricanes, oil spills, and other adverse impacts, industries still have a proven track record of improving environmental performance. The Consumer Energy Alliance, CEA, a leading voice for sensible energy policies for families and businesses, found that emissions declined by 71% across Louisiana since 1990, while Louisiana's gross domestic product surged 177% over the same period. While Louisiana's total per capita energy consumption is among the top 3 states in the nation, and more than 88% of the state's energy needs are met by oil and natural gas, Louisiana's emissions of key pollutants still decreased across the board from 1990 to 2019, with a 71% reduction in sulfur dioxide, 66% reduction in nitrogen oxides, 49% reduction in carbon monoxide, 17% reduction in volatile organic compounds. This task force, with its diverse group of stakeholders, now has an opportunity to show the world that Louisiana can be a global leader in developing collaborative climate change solutions. The oil and gas and related industries have strived to meet their environmental responsibilities by impressively reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As a global leader for coastal restoration, it is now time for Louisiana to take a more holistic look at coastal projects to explore the carbon offset potential in addition to the coastal protection potential. Coastal wetlands act as a carbon sink, sequestering carbon at a much faster rate than forests and continue to do so for millions of years. The potential for our wetlands to serve as valuable assets in carbon trading markets should be considered. The Atchafalaya River provides a prime example of the carbon offset potential through the beneficial use of dredged material, large wetlands and ecosystem creation and restoration at Horseshoe Bend on the Atchafalaya River was highlighted at the climate talks in Paris in 2015. The Creating Horseshoe Bend Island project was developed through the Corps of Engineers Engineering with Nature initiative. Material dredged from Horseshoe Bend on the Atchafalaya River was strategically placed mid-river, upriver of a naturally occurring island over a 12-year period. The mounted material was dispersed by the river's currents to self-design the island over time. Horseshoe Bend Island now provides a variety of habitat types supporting complex communities of vegetation, invertebrates, soil microbes, and higher organisms. The landform characteristics support a large, successful wading bird rookery, and the soils display a capacity to sequester nutrients and other compounds. A copy of the article, Creating Horseshoe Bend Island, Atchafalaya River, Louisiana, is attached to these comments for further reference. There are additional examples of land creation through the beneficial use of dredged material from the Atchafalaya River. Approximately 1 million cubic yards is removed annually during normal years. However, with each occurrence of high water, more sediment drops off in the Atchafalaya River. In late 2018 and 2019, the region experienced the highest rainfall in 122 years, and the Atchafalaya River at Morgan City was above flood stage for over 200 days. 8.3 million cubic yards of sediment was removed from Crew Boat Cut and the upper and lower bay in 2019. All material was used beneficially, some of it going to the Atchafalaya Wildlife Management Area camp. Soon after the dredge material emerged above the waterline, birds began to feed and nest. Within a few months, healthy vegetation was beginning to cover the surface, and photos are attached that we can circulate. We can arrive at collaborative solutions protecting the industry that has fed our people for so long and using our land building capabilities to protect us from storms and further reduce our carbon footprint. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide comments. I have a few more, Mr. Chair. Should I go here, or do you want to go to if there are any more in the people participating online? I don't, however you want to do it.
Sure, we can give you a break and go to the folks on the Zoom.
We have a raised hand from Elizabeth Maxwell. Elizabeth, I'm going to unmute you now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my comment. I just wanted to say briefly, I'm a 10th generation Louisiana resident. I'm from New Orleans, and just to some of the debate today around the some of the competing objectives is what I hear of the task force, and previous public comments around enabling the transition while reducing the overall carbon emissions of the state and how we're counting those emissions. I just wanted to make a brief comment that around my perspective on someone made a point earlier around, well, if the Northeast is demanding fossil fuels still, that's not our responsibility to stop producing them. Rather, we, they from the demand side there will make their own changes. And in responding to the previous public comment read aloud around are the oil and gas companies that have been the economic engine of the state for the past century, I think that the task force should make recommendations in line with supporting companies that have been the base of the economy of our state, getting on board with the economy of the future. And if fossil fuel companies in our state want to be part of a renewable energy transition, I think we should welcome and include that. But I don't think it will do them any good and produce any taxes for the state and benefit any residents by continuing to pollute and harm the environment. We're just setting those companies up for failure. We're avoiding the inevitable decline of oil and gas. And we need to all get on board with the renewable transition and build wealth and health in the community at the same time. And so if we want to take care of our companies and our economy and the people here, then we all need to be fully on board with the renewable transition and support each other in figuring out how to do so. So thank you for taking my comment.
Okay, I'm going to read one from Caitlin Schmedke. She's the Executive Director for the Gulf Coast Consumer Energy Alliance. On behalf of Consumer Energy Alliance and our membership across Louisiana, we write today to share our comments in support of the Climate Task Force and the positive impacts that the task force will have on Louisiana and the improvements that traditional energy development, related infrastructure, and fuels have made over the past 30 years to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Founded in 2006, CEA is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization advocating for balanced energy and environmental policies and responsible access to resources. CEA represents virtually every sector of the U.S. economy, from the iron and steel industries to truckers, airlines, agriculture, labor organizations, restaurants, chemical manufacturers, small businesses, and families all across the nation that are concerned about U.S. energy policies, energy security and affordability, environmental stewardship, and long-term price and support reliability. CEA has more than 550,000 individual members and almost 300 academic, nonprofit, corporate, and union affiliates throughout the United States. Our members support a rational, all of the above energy policy that utilizes all of our domestic natural resources, both traditional and renewable, while ensuring aggressive environmental protections and solutions are put in place. Over the past 30 years, emissions in Louisiana have fallen by more than 71%, even as the state economy grew. The economic growth and the reduction in emissions highlights that it is possible and indeed advisable to support efforts to ensure the nation has sufficient energy production to meet our daily needs and strive for ever improving environmental standards. The analysis highlights data from 1990 to 2017 showing key pollutants in Louisiana have decreased, including a 71% reduction in sulfur dioxide, 66% reduction in nitrogen oxides, 49% reduction in carbon monoxide, and a 17% reduction in volatile organic compounds. Additionally, from 2000 to 2016, Louisiana's carbon dioxide emissions decreased by almost 8%, while energy production and pipeline development expanded across the state. Over the past 30 years, Louisiana has also seen a 177% growth in the state's gross domestic product, a 17% increase in vehicle miles traveled per capita, and a 10% increase in population. Despite this incredible growth, the state was able to reduce emissions, further highlighting that energy and the environment can and do coexist. As the task force moves forward in creating strategies and recommendations, please consider the technological and environmental advancements that the industry has made over the past few decades. It is critical that the nation press forward with rigorous environmental standards and continue to lead the world in environmental progress while we ensure safe, affordable, and reliable energy for all Americans. Louisiana's robust energy industry must and will be part of that equation. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Caitlin Schmidtke. The next comment is from Henri Boulet with the Louisiana LA1 Coalition. Sorry about that. As you're aware, the LA1 Coalition seeks to improve the highway infrastructure in between US Highway 90 and Port Fourchon Grand Isle. In working with our partners at the state and federal level, we have learned that LA1 is vital to national energy security, to both our commercial and recreational fishing interests, to our tourism economy, and certainly to our coastal restoration economy. Continued investments in new energy sources along our coast and investments in our fisheries, tourism, and restoration economies will be vital to our communities' long-term economic sustainability and hence our unique Southeast Louisiana culture. We recognize Governor Edwards' creation of the Climate Task Force to reduce greenhouse gas emissions originating in Louisiana. We believe that it is possible to have robust multi-sector industries that create jobs and economic opportunity along our coast and to continue to lower our region's greenhouse gas emissions. Economic and environmental benefits are not an either-or decision in Louisiana. We can and we do have both. With this in mind, as the task force develops recommendations, we encourage you to consider the significant emissions reductions that our state's industries have achieved in recent years and companies' continued investments in coastal restoration projects to sustain our invaluable wetlands. According to the Consumer Energy Alliance's Louisiana emissions analysis, emissions declined by 71% across the state since 1990. This decrease is impressive given that Louisiana's gross domestic product surged over the same period. This demonstrates that emissions reductions and economic growth are not mutually exclusive. Industry has a proven track record of utilizing new technologies to improve environmental performance during times of growth and investment. LA1 Coalition thanks you and the members of the task force for all your work, and we look forward to working closely with you on a path forward for our working coast. Okay, I have one from Michael Tritico from Restore Explicit Symmetry to Our Ravaged Earth. This says the Louisiana Greta Thunberg Full Ride Scholarship Program. There will be each year at each public university in the state of Louisiana awarded to a qualified student a 4-year scholarship to pay all expenses expected to occur for that student. Those expenses should include, but not be limited to, tuition, room and board, medical insurance, transportation expenses, textbooks and laboratory fees, technological resources such as computers, microscopes, field sampling, and monitoring equipment. The student must have previously demonstrated concern about environmental problems. The student must have previously shown an above average ability to study, learn, work with other people, and communicate succinctly, verbally, and writing. The student's choice of coursework must emphasize the basic and advanced natural sciences, as well as fundamental communications courses such as English composition, diction, and a foreign language. Should the student excel during the undergraduate 4 years, the scholarship will be extended for graduate degree work. Funding for the scholarship will be provided by a public-private effort supported by Green Foundation's non-taxpayer university income, the State of Louisiana General Fund, and the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality's beneficial environmental project revenues. And Okay, so then the title of this email, I guess it was more relevant. It should proposal for the Climate Initiatives Task Force to make happen. So this is a proposal for us to consider the scholarship. And then the next one I have is from the Bayou Industrial Group, signed by Jennifer Armand, the executive director. It says, Dear Mr. Vorhoff, the Bayou Industrial Group represents 150 businesses, advocacy groups, and governmental organizations in Lafourche, Terrebonne, St. Mary, and Assumption parishes of southeastern Louisiana, a region that proudly considers itself America's working coast. Here we produce the energy that fuels America, and our coastal communities play a vital role in servicing Gulf of Mexico oil and gas production. BIG and our members appreciate the tremendous energy and economic benefits that offshore oil and gas production contribute to our region and our nation. We also recognize Governor Edwards for the creation of the Climate Task Force to reduce greenhouse gas emissions originating in Louisiana. BIG believes that it is possible to have both a robust oil and gas industry that creates jobs and economic opportunity alongside a healthy and sustainable environment to live and work for generations. Economic and environmental benefits are not an either-or decision. In Louisiana, we can and do have both. With this in mind, we encourage you to consider the significant emissions reductions that our state's industry has achieved in recent years and companies' continued investments in coastal restoration projects to sustain our invaluable wetlands as the task force develops recommendations. According to the Consumer Energy Alliance's Louisiana emissions analysis, emissions declined by 71% across the state since 1990. This sharp decrease is remarkable given that Louisiana's gross domestic product surged 177% over the same period. This demonstrates that emissions reductions and economic growth are not mutually exclusive. Industry has a proven track record of improving environmental performance during times of growth and investment. Bayou Industrial Group thanks you and the members of the task force for all your work, and we encourage you to strongly consider the ongoing contributions of our oil and gas industry to environmental stewardship and economic vitality as you determine your plan of action. And then the last one I think I have is from Lori LeBlanc, the executive director of the Gulf Economic Survival Team. And this says, Dear Mr. Vorhoff, the Gulf Economic Survival Team, GEST, is a grassroots association comprised of small, medium, and large energy support companies, as well as allied businesses and trade associations with a mission to promote the significance of Gulf energy to our nation, our state, and our local economies. GEST members represent the indirect and induced jobs created by the oil and gas industry. We recognize that the backbone of our state and our nation's economy are our small and family-owned businesses, and many of them are right here in Louisiana servicing the oil and gas industry. Thank you for the opportunity to submit comments regarding the Louisiana Climate Initiatives Task Force. The task force presents Louisiana a tremendous opportunity to engage a diverse group of stakeholders and to demonstrate that Louisiana can be a global leader in developing policy recommendations that build upon Louisiana's natural strengths. Louisiana has a long history of producing American energy for our nation, and we have proven economic growth and environmental sustainability are not mutually exclusive. Louisiana is blessed to have two areas of strength in the carbon emissions space that sets us apart from other states and other countries. These include carbon capture, use, and sequestration, CCUS, and land-based sequestration. Louisiana has some of the best geology in the world for CCUS, and we have a skilled workforce that is more than capable of constructing major CCUS projects and infrastructure. According to a study by ICF in 2019, the oil and gas industry supported nearly 250,000 jobs in the state and provided $14.5 billion in wages to in-state workers. We must ensure that policy changes do not negatively impact our existing jobs, but instead changes should result in creating new jobs. CCUS has immense potential for creating jobs which will help keep trained Louisianians employed in the state. In addition, the task force should take a more holistic look at Louisiana's successful coastal restoration projects as an opportunity to reduce carbon emissions and explore future restoration projects for their carbon offset potential. Increasing the value of coastal restoration projects with an additional benefit of carbon emission reduction also provides an opportunity to further protect our coastal communities and our rich cultural heritage. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to submit comments, and we look forward to participating in future task force meetings. If you have any questions, please contact me at lori@gulfeconomicsurvival.org. And that brings us current with the climate email address.
Thank you, Charles. And I don't believe I see anyone else's hand raised. No. Maxwell, we got your comment already. So with that, look forward to meeting with you all again in about 4 weeks for our all hands on deck meeting. You'll receive a an email with a doodle poll to make sure that we can get on everybody's schedule as soon as possible. And with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Okay, I think that was Mr. Daniels. Second?
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very
Aye.
much. Appreciate it, everybody.
Thank
Likewise.
you.
Thanks, everyone.